The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty streets of Deadwood as Henry Clark stepped down from the stagecoach, his polished boots immediately collecting a layer of frontier dust. The young sheriff's Eastern attire and clean-shaven face marked him as an outsider, but there was a determined set to his jaw that suggested he wouldn't remain an outsider for long. Having left behind a promising law career in Boston, Henry had accepted this remote posting for reasons that went beyond mere career advancement. The town's main street stretched before him like an open wound in the earth, bordered by weathered wooden buildings that seemed to lean inward with conspiratorial intent. A warm wind carried the mingled scents of horse manure, wood smoke, and something else. A sickly sweet aroma that Henry recognized from his time investigating opium dens back east. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the source. The Golden Palace Saloon, its gaudy facade a stark contrast to the utilitarian structures surrounding it. Frank Taylor stood watching from the saloon's upper balcony, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as someone who had found prosperity in this harsh territory. The saloon owner's weather-beaten face remained impassive as he observed the new lawman, but his fingers drummed an agitated rhythm on the wooden railing. Below, his enforcer, Charlie Moore, emerged from the shadows between buildings, casually adjusting the gun belt that rode low on his hips. The disappearance of the previous sheriff, Daniel Walker, had left a vacuum of authority that Frank Taylor had been quick to fill. But it wasn't just Walker's absence that haunted the town. The unsolved murder of Rachel Anderson, the banker's daughter, had cast a pall over Deadwood that even Taylor's whiskey couldn't wash away. Her father, Robert Anderson, had withdrawn into his bank like a wounded animal into its den, refusing to speak about his daughter's final days. Margaret Clark had warned her brother about taking this position, had begged him to remain in Boston where their family name still carried weight. But Henry couldn't shake the memory of the letter he'd received from Rachel Anderson just days before her death. A letter that hinted at corruption reaching far beyond the borders of this dusty town, implicating powerful men in both the railroad company and territorial government in a massive land fraud scheme. The hotel owner, Martha Taylor, Frank's estranged sister, greeted Henry with a warmth that seemed genuine, though her eyes held shadows of their own. As she showed him to his room, she spoke in hushed tones about the changes that had come over her brother in recent years, how the promise of wealth from the railroad's expansion had twisted something in his soul. The way she glanced over her shoulder suggested she feared being overheard, even within her own establishment. Laura Moore, the young widow who ran the town's only newspaper, watched Henry's arrival from her office window with more than professional interest. Her husband's death 6 months earlier, ruled an accident when his horse supposedly threw him, had occurred the same week he'd begun investigating land deed records that Rachel Anderson had asked him to examine. Laura had continued pulling at those threads, despite anonymous threats left on her printing press. That evening, as Henry unpacked his meager belongings, a commotion erupted in the street below. Susan Walker, the missing sheriff's wife, was being forcibly removed from the Golden Palace by Charlie Moore and his men. Her accusations echoed off the buildings, claims of evidence hidden in the saloon's basement, of midnight meetings between Frank Taylor and railroad executives, of her husband's discovery of something that had sealed his fate. The new sheriff's first test came sooner than expected. As he descended the hotel stairs, Henry caught glimpses of familiar faces watching from windows and doorways. Robert Anderson from his bank, Martha Taylor from her kitchen, Laura Moore from her newspaper office. They all held pieces of a puzzle that had already claimed several lives, and Henry suspected that solving it would require him to question everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the price of progress in the American West. The streets of Deadwood grew quiet as darkness fell, but Henry Clark remained awake, studying the town's layout by lamplight. His fingers traced the routes between the Golden Palace, the bank, and the railroad office, while his mind worked through the connections between Frank Taylor, the missing sheriff, and Rachel Anderson's final days. Something about this town's particular brand of corruption felt personal, orchestrated rather than opportunistic, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched even now. A knock at Henry's door broke his concentration. He reached instinctively for his revolver before recognizing Laura Moore's distinctive pattern. 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, their agreed-upon signal. The newspaper editor slipped inside, clutching a leather portfolio that had seen better days, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained urgency. "I found something in Rachel's old desk at the bank," Laura whispered, spreading several documents across Henry's makeshift investigation table. She'd been tracking shipments between Cheyenne and Deadwood that don't match any legitimate railroad manifests. The quantities suggest opium, but the papers are marked as dry goods and farming equipment. Henry studied the neat columns of Rachel's precise handwriting, noting how certain numbers had been circled in red ink. The young banker's daughter had been thorough, methodical, traits that likely got her killed. But she'd also been clever enough to hide copies of her findings, trusting Laura to know where to look. Outside, a wagon clattered down the muddy street, its wheels throwing up dark sprays in the dim lamplight. The sound reminded Henry of his first night in Boston's Harbor District, watching smugglers work under cover of routine commerce. Here in Deadwood, Frank Taylor had perfected that art, wrapping his operation in layers of legitimate business and carefully cultivated respectability. "Martha Taylor came to me this afternoon," Henry said, keeping his voice low. "Said her husband's been holding private meetings at the Golden Palace after hours. Names she mentioned match some of these shipping records." He tapped one of Rachel's documents. "Daniel Cooper, Charlie Webb, railroad men who've been buying up failed ranches around Deadwood at suspicious prices." Laura nodded grimly. The previous sheriff, Susan's husband, started asking questions about those land deals 2 days before he disappeared. Susan swears he'd uncovered something big, but all his notes vanished with him. The only thing left in his desk was this. She produced a small brass key with an unusual triangular head. The pieces were starting to align, but Henry knew they were still missing crucial connections. Rachel's murder, the sheriff's disappearance, the land grabs, and the opium trade, separate threads of the same dark tapestry. And somewhere in the middle sat Frank Taylor, watching the town's desperation grow while he played both victim and savior. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and both Henry and Laura froze. Footsteps approached, paused, then continued past. Henry released his grip on his revolver but noticed Laura's hand remained tight on the portfolio. Trust came dear in Deadwood, earned in small measures and lost in catastrophic moments of betrayal. "Margaret at the telegraph office," Laura continued once the footsteps faded. "She's been keeping records of all Frank's communications with Cheyenne. Says there's been an unusual pattern lately. Messages about cattle prices that don't match any actual sales. Could be a code." Henry added Margaret's name to his growing map of allies and suspects. Robert Anderson's banking records, Martha Taylor's observations of her husband's meetings, Laura's access to Rachel's research, and now Margaret's telegraph logs. A web of information that could either save the town or get them all killed. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern sky in shades of threat and promise. Henry knew that somewhere in Deadwood, Frank Taylor was already awake, moving his pieces across the board with practiced precision. But for the first time since arriving, Henry felt the advantage shifting. Rachel Anderson had left them a trail, and with Laura's help, he intended to follow it to its bloody end. "We need to get into the Golden Palace's private rooms," Henry decided, studying the triangular key. Whatever the previous sheriff found, whatever Rachel died trying to expose, the proof we need is behind one of Frank Taylor's locked doors. And thanks to Susan's husband, we might just have the key. Laura gathered the documents with swift efficiency, but paused before returning them to her portfolio. "Be careful, Henry. Frank's influence reaches further than just Deadwood. The last person who tried to expose him ended up face down in the creek between here and Cheyenne. Rachel was smart, dedicated, and she still died alone in that alley." Henry adjusted his gun belt and glanced at the setting sun painting long shadows across Deadwood's dusty main street. The key felt heavy in his pocket. Not just metal, but the weight of responsibility and risk that came with it. He'd learned quickly that in this town, even the simplest actions could have deadly consequences, especially when they involved Frank Taylor's interests. Laura rolled the documents carefully, securing them with a leather strap before tucking them into her satchel. "There's something else you should know," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Martha from the telegraph office mentioned seeing unusual activity at the old Anderson ranch last night. Riders coming and going well past midnight. And they weren't the usual ranch hands." The information piqued Henry's interest. The Anderson ranch had been sitting empty since Rachel's death, its buildings slowly deteriorating under the harsh Dakota winds. If Frank's men were showing interest in the property now, it couldn't be coincidence. "Did Martha recognize any of them?" he asked, already calculating the distance to the ranch and the risks of investigating after dark. Sheriff Henry Anderson leaned against the weather-worn hitching post outside Red Rock's general store, his crisp eastern suit already gathering a fine layer of prairie dust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty street as he observed Martha Clark hurrying into the mercantile, clutching her shawl tight despite the warming spring air. 3 weeks into his new post, and the town's residents still regarded him with the same mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility they'd shown on day one. Through careful conversations at the barber shop and post office, Henry had pieced together the basics of what happened to his predecessor. Sheriff Robert Walker had been investigating both the murder of young Rachel Moore and the disappearance of several Chinese laborers from the railroad camp when he vanished without a trace. The official story claimed he'd abandoned his post, but Henry had found Walker's badge buried in his desk drawer. No deserting lawman would leave that behind. Frank Taylor's saloon dominated the town's social life, its garishly painted facade a stark contrast to the humble storefronts lining Main Street. Henry watched as Daniel Clark, the banker whose daughter Rachel had been killed, emerged from the establishment looking decidedly worse for wear. The man's decline had been swift after Rachel's death, his once prosperous bank now teetering on the edge of closure while Taylor's influence grew. Susan Anderson, no relation to Henry despite sharing his surname, ran the town's small newspaper with a fierce dedication to uncovering the truth. She'd shown Henry Rachel's final article draft, discovered hidden in the girl's bedroom after her death. The hastily scribbled notes hinted at massive land fraud involving the railroad's planned route through Red Rock, with thousands of acres changing hands just weeks before the official announcement. The investigation had led Henry to Charlie Moore, Rachel's uncle, and a former ranch hand who'd witnessed suspicious meetings between railroad executives and local power brokers. But Moore proved maddeningly difficult to pin down, always seeming to vanish just before Henry could question him. The few times they'd spoken, Moore's eyes had darted nervously toward Taylor's saloon, his hands trembling as he made excuses to leave. Margaret Walker, the missing sheriff's wife, maintained a quiet dignity despite the whispered accusations about her husband's character. She'd shared with Henry a letter Robert had written the night before his disappearance, describing a breakthrough in the case. The next morning, his horse had been found wandering the plains, saddle empty and reins trailing in the dust. No other trace of him had ever been found. Laura Taylor, the saloon keeper's wife, proved an unexpected ally. During chance encounters at the general store, she'd dropped subtle hints about her husband's business dealings and late-night meetings with men from Dodge City. Henry sensed she knew far more than she revealed, but fear kept her silent. The bruises she tried to hide beneath high collars told their own story. The pieces started coming together when Henry discovered an old survey map in Rachel's personal effects, showing a very different railroad route than the one officially announced. The original plan would have bypassed Red Rock entirely, taking the tracks through rival cattle town Cheyenne instead. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the railroad chose Red Rock, and they'd killed to keep that secret. As Henry dug deeper, he began noticing small changes in the town's atmosphere. Strangers appeared on the streets, hard-eyed men who watched his movements with predatory interest. Anonymous notes appeared on his desk, warning him to leave well enough alone. But it was the discovery of Charlie Moore's ranch house, burnt to the ground with no sign of its owner, that confirmed he was on the right track. The web of corruption stretched far beyond Red Rock's borders. Telegraph inquiries to El Paso and Deadwood revealed similar patterns of land speculation and violence surrounding railroad developments. Henry compiled a detailed report for the territorial marshal, but before he could send it, Susan Anderson's newspaper office was vandalized, and all his gathered evidence disappeared from the sheriff's office safe. Yet the most disturbing discovery came from Martha Clark, who'd been Rachel's closest friend. The banker's daughter had uncovered evidence that the missing Chinese laborers hadn't simply abandoned their work. They'd been forced to dig something in the dead of night, far from the railroad's intended path. Whatever they'd buried out there in the vast prairie had been worth killing for, and finding it might be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy. Henry knew investigating the Chinese laborers' mysterious night work would be dangerous, but he hadn't expected to find Frank Miller's men already waiting when he rode out to the suspected burial site at dawn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass as 3 riders emerged from behind a cluster of cottonwoods, their horses' bridles jingling ominously in the still air. He recognized Robert Hayes, Miller's enforcer, by the distinctive silver-studded gun belt that had become a symbol of fear throughout Red Rock. The encounter left Henry with a broken rib and a clear message: stay away from the railroad's business. but it also confirmed he was probing in the right direction. Back in town, Susan Anderson helped bind his wounds while sharing what her newspaper sources had uncovered about similar patterns of missing Chinese workers in Cheyenne. The railroad's expansion was leaving a trail of disappeared men across the territory, all vanishing after completing secretive night work. Martha Clark proved an unexpected ally, having preserved some of Rachel's original documentation despite the banker's daughter's murder. The papers revealed a complex network of shell companies purchasing land along proposed railroad routes, with Frank Miller's Saloon serving as a front for moving money between Red Rock and banking houses in Dodge City. But it was the mention of Daniel Webster, a former territorial judge now residing in El Paso, that caught Henry's attention. Late that night, working by lamplight in his office, Henry mapped out the connections. Webster had presided over land dispute cases involving the railroad, consistently ruling in their favor before abruptly retiring to El Paso with newfound wealth. The judge's rulings had forced several ranchers, including Charlie Moore, to sell their properties at fraction of their worth. The telegraph operator confirmed Webster had visited Red Rock multiple times in the months before Rachel's murder. Susan's research through old newspaper archives revealed another disturbing pattern. In each town where Chinese laborers vanished, valuable mineral deposits were later discovered along the railroad's adjusted routes. Henry suspected Rachel had uncovered evidence that Miller and his railroad conspirators were using forced labor to secretly survey and mine promising sites before filing adjusted rail plans to claim the resources. The missing workers were loose ends that needed tying up. Margaret Turner, the weathered owner of Red Rock's general store, recalled seeing unfamiliar wagons loaded with mining equipment heading north toward Charlie Moore's ranch in the weeks before it burned. The timing aligned with Martha's account of Rachel frantically copying documents the night she died. Chase's men spread out through town, seeking tactical positions, while townspeople who had endured Taylor's tyranny for years emerged with rifles and shotguns. Susan Thompson, the schoolteacher, proved particularly deadly with her father's old Sharps rifle, picking off two of Chase's men who tried to flank the livery stable. The battle for Red Rock raged through sunset and into the night. Fires broke out in several buildings, casting an apocalyptic glow over the gunfight. Henry's deputies held their ground, but Chase's professional gunmen were gradually wearing them down. The turning point came when Margaret, the telegraph operator's wife, managed to slip through enemy lines with a message. The marshals from Cheyenne and Dodge City were less than an hour away. Chase must have had his own lookouts, because suddenly his men began falling back, gathering their dead and wounded. The railroad man himself stayed behind, facing Henry in the flickering light of the burning buildings. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he growled. "You have no idea how far this goes. All the way to Washington." Henry stood his ground, rifle ready. "Then that's where I'll go next. This stops here, Chase." The arrival of the marshals prevented further bloodshed, but Henry knew Chase was right. This was far from over. As he helped Rachel prepare the evidence for transport to the territorial capital, he realized Red Rock had changed him as much as he had changed it. The idealistic Boston lawman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that justice in the West required more than just a badge and good intentions. Laura, the murdered banker's daughter, would finally have her justice. Her father broke down in tears when Henry personally delivered the news that her killers would face prosecution. The old man had aged years in the months since her death, but now there was hope in his eyes again. As Henry watched the sun rise over the plains the next morning, he knew his decision to come west had been the right one, despite the cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Rock's dusty main street as Sheriff Henry Anderson emerged from his office, his silver badge gleaming. After 3 months of meticulous investigation, he finally held concrete evidence linking Frank Taylor's saloon empire to both the opium trade and the disappearance of Rachel Clark, the banker's daughter. The worn leather journal in his coat pocket contained her detailed accounts of the railroad land fraud scheme, carefully hidden before she vanished. Margaret Moore watched from her dressmaker's shop window as the young sheriff strode purposefully toward the Gilded Spur Saloon. She had grown fond of the Boston lawman since his arrival, admiring how he'd methodically pieced together the corruption that had claimed her friend Rachel's life. Her hands trembled slightly as she recalled finding Rachel's hastily scrawled note just days before she disappeared. Inside the saloon, Frank Taylor sat at his usual corner table, flanked by his enforcer Charlie Walker and the railroad's local representative, Robert Anderson, no relation to the sheriff. The three men fell silent as Henry pushed through the batwing doors, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The usual morning crowd of cowboys and drifters sensed the tension and began quietly filing out. "I know what happened to Rachel Clark," Henry announced, his voice carrying across the now empty saloon. "And I know about the forged land deeds, the opium shipments hidden in railroad cargo, and the bribes paid to keep it all quiet." He withdrew Rachel's journal, watching Taylor's face carefully. The saloon owner's practiced poker expression slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine fear. Susan Taylor, Frank's wife, descended the saloon's grand staircase with deliberate steps, her silk dress rustling. She had married Frank believing he was a legitimate businessman, only to discover the true source of his wealth. Now, after years of silence, she was ready to reveal what she had witnessed the night Rachel disappeared, including her husband's role in the murder of the previous sheriff. The confrontation erupted into violence when Charlie Walker drew his gun, but Henry had anticipated the move. His own revolver cleared leather first, the shot catching Walker's shoulder. Robert Anderson tried to flee through the kitchen, but Margaret Moore was waiting at the back door with Daniel Clark, Rachel's father and the bank president, who had finally found the courage to stand against Taylor's corruption. As Taylor was led away in handcuffs, Laura Anderson, the sheriff's sister, who had followed him west to serve as the town's schoolteacher, discovered a hidden cellar beneath the saloon. There, they found not only documentation of the land fraud scheme, but also evidence of Taylor's connections to criminal enterprises stretching from Dodge City to El Paso, and even as far as Deadwood and Cheyenne. Martha Walker, Charlie's wife, and the town's telegraph operator had been secretly corresponding with law enforcement in those cities, helping build a case against Taylor's network. Her position had allowed her to intercept and copy incriminating messages while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to Taylor. Now, Her evidence would help dismantle similar operations across the frontier. The trial that followed became legendary in Red Rock's history. Susan Taylor's testimony revealed how Rachel Clark had discovered the fraud while working at her father's bank, documenting the scheme in her journal before confronting Frank. The young woman's body was finally found in an abandoned mine shaft, allowing her family to properly lay her to rest. Henry's investigation had exposed more than just a corrupt saloon owner. It had revealed how the promise of the frontier had been perverted by greed. The railroad's grand plans for Red Rock had been built on stolen land and false deeds, leaving honest ranchers and farmers to suffer while criminals prospered. Now, with Taylor's empire crumbling, those wrongs could finally be made right. Margaret Moore and Henry Anderson married that autumn, combining her sharp business sense with his unwavering integrity to help rebuild Red Rock's reputation. Susan Taylor, divorced and freed from her husband's shadow, used her share of the seized assets to establish a home for women escaping similar situations. The town's transformation became a model for other frontier communities struggling with corruption. The case changed how railroad expansion was monitored across the territory, with new safeguards put in place to prevent land fraud. Daniel Clark's bank became known for its honest dealings, while Laura Anderson's school thrived as families returned to Red Rock, no longer afraid of Taylor's influence. The town had faced its darkness and emerged stronger, proving that justice could prevail even in the wildest corners of the frontier. Years later, when asked about the case, Henry would credit not his own detective work, but the courage of ordinary citizens like Martha Walker and Susan Taylor, who risked everything to stand against corruption. Rachel Clark's journal remained in the town archives, a testament to one young woman's determination to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Red Rock had found its redemption not through gunfights and vengeance, but through the quiet heroism of those who chose to do what was right. The transformation of Red Rock continued long after the Taylor case was closed. Henry found himself adjusting to a different kind of law enforcement, one focused on building community trust rather than chasing outlaws. The weekly town meetings, once tense affairs dominated by Taylor's men, became forums for genuine civic engagement. Local ranchers like Charlie Peterson, who had previously kept to themselves out of fear, now actively participated in shaping the town's future. Martha Walker's testimony against the corrupt railroad executives had ripple effects beyond Red Rock's borders. When similar land fraud schemes were uncovered in Cheyenne and Deadwood, investigators sought her expertise. She eventually became an informal advisor to territorial authorities, helping them understand the complex web of railroad corruption that had plagued the frontier. Her small boarding house transformed into a gathering place for reformers and honest businessmen traveling through the territory. Susan Taylor's decision to testify against her husband came at great personal cost, but she found unexpected support from the women of Red Rock. Under Laura Anderson's guidance, she opened a small dressmaking shop, providing employment for former saloon girls who wished to leave their past behind. The shop became a symbol of redemption, proving that even those closest to corruption could choose a different path. Daniel Clark channeled his grief over Rachel's death into positive change. He established a scholarship in her name at Laura's school, specifically for young women interested in journalism and investigation. The first recipient was Martha's teenage daughter, who shared Rachel's passion for uncovering truth. The bank also created new protocols for documenting land transactions, making it harder for future fraudsters to manipulate property records. The railroad station, once a symbol of corruption, was rebuilt with community involvement. Local craftsmen added touches that honored Rachel's memory. A small reading room filled with newspapers from across the territory, and a wall bearing the names of those who had fought for justice in Red Rock. The station became a proud landmark, rather than a reminder of dark times. Henry's reputation grew beyond Red Rock's borders. When trouble arose in neighboring towns, they often sought his counsel. He helped establish a network of honest lawmen across the territory, sharing information about criminal operations that tried to establish new footholds after Taylor's fall. His methods, focusing on investigation and community cooperation rather than gunfights, became a model for younger sheriffs. The opium trade that had once flowed freely through Red Rock's saloons dried up as neighboring communities joined the effort to block illegal shipments. Former addicts found support through a recovery program started by Margaret, the doctor's wife, who had seen firsthand the damage the drug had caused. The program spread to Dodge City and El Paso, creating a chain of sanctuary points for those seeking help. Years later, when railroad executives proposed a new spur line through Red Rock, they found a transformed community. The town council, led by Martha Walker and other civic leaders, negotiated fair terms that benefited both the railroad and local residents. The agreement became a template for other frontier towns dealing with railroad expansion, proving that progress and integrity could coexist. Laura Anderson's school flourished, attracting students from across the territory. Many were the children of families who had fled Taylor's reign and now returned, drawn by Red Rock's reputation for honest governance and strong community bonds. The curriculum included lessons on civic responsibility and journalism, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of standing against corruption. As Henry grew older, he often visited Rachel's grave, leaving fresh flowers and copies of newspaper articles about positive changes in the town she had died trying to protect. Her journal, carefully preserved in the town archives, became required reading for students at Laura's school, teaching them that one person's courage could spark lasting change. Red Rock had become more than just another frontier town. It was living proof that justice, though slow, would ultimately prevail.